I now give the floor to Ms. Sawsan Abou Zainedin.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, 13 years ago, we, brave Syrian women and men, took to the streets claiming what's rightfully ours, a say in how we live and how our country is governed. Our message was clear. Syria لينا وما هي لبيت الأسد.
Syria is ours and it is not the property of the Assad family.
13 years on, thousands continue to demonstrate in the streets of Sweden, undeterred by intimidations. For over a year now, they have been asserting that Syria is ours and is not the property of the Assad family, or, for that matter, any of the de facto authorities that have emerged in the past 13 years. Protesters in Idlib, Aleppo, Qamishli, and Deir ez-Zor, and beyond, echo this sentiment. In the years between these two moments, hundreds of thousands of us have been killed. Tens of thousands forcibly disappeared or tortured to death, and millions have been displaced. Those who remain live in a fragmented Syria, ruled by de facto authorities, including that of the Assad-regime, who rules by force and not by legitimacy. But I'm not here today to recount atrocities you know very well, nor am I here to stir your emotions or appeal to your sense of humanity. We are beyond that. I am here today to say that we are invincible, even in the face of your contentious politics. And I'm going to explain why and propose that we leverage this determination to break the political deadlock that we all face. Members of the Council, let's speak accountability. When Russia and China vetoed this Council's resolution to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court in 2014, we persisted. We found creative workaround to the limitations imposed by this Council's political dynamics. Our documentation and advocacy led to the creation of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the first UN accountability mechanism of its kind. And this paved the way for all of us to use universal jurisdiction to pursue accountability. Thanks to the relentless efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders, including women-led groups, today, perpetrators are facing trials in the courts of the world, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in the US, and in the UK. And thanks to the same efforts, the Netherlands and Canada brought Syria to the International Court of Justice. And members of the Council, exactly a year ago, in November 2023, the ICJ issued a landmark ruling demanding Syria end torture, a call the regime has blatantly ignored. And as Syrians stood outside the ICJ that day demanding accountability, they were still fighting for the creation of the independent institution on missing persons, for their right to truth and justice. And yes, they did have the General Assembly establishing that last year. On chemical weapons, a crime that shocked the world, we didn't give up either. Despite Russia's repeated vetoes, our determination to seek justice remains persistent. In fact, tomorrow in The Hague, Syrian civil society will host members of the international community in our second conference on chemical weapons, where we will highlight progress in this regard. Our collective efforts, the collective efforts of Syrian victims, survivors, and human rights defenders have led to two historic developments. First, the international arrest warrants for Bashar al-Assad and others, holding them accountable for their role in the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This marks the first ever warrant issued by a foreign court against a sitting head of state. for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a groundbreaking precedent. And second, the first of its kind working group to advance proposals for criminal accountability for chemical weapon use, consisting of states from nearly every region of the world coming together to say no to impunity. Members of the Council, the political dynamics have also hindered access for millions of Syrians to aid, but not our will to act. After last year's earthquakes, it took a week for the UN to secure the Syrian government's permission and approval to open border crossings into northwest Syria. An entire week, when every second counted. During that critical time, our own white helmets, alongside tens of humanitarian Syrian organizations and voluntary groups, were the only responders. We did our utmost when the United Nations of this world hesitated, despite legal scholars affirming that it had the authority under international law. But politics prevailed. And then came the Russian vetoes to end cross-border aid altogether, pushing the UN to a consent-based model, granting the Syrian regime power over aid delivery across Syria. This is a regime with a track record of deadly sieges, of obstructing cross-line aid, of tampering with humanitarian convoys, stripping them of life-saving medical supplies. A regime notorious for its innovative methods of aid diversion has been, in practice, granted a de facto veto power over Syrians' rights to humanitarian assistance by this Council's politics. So yes, it is all politics. Yet, on the one issue that requires political resolve and diplomatic ingenuity, this Council remains paralyzed. Members of the Council, I'm speaking of Resolution 2254. For 13 years, the international community has complicitly politicized every technical aspect of the Syrian conflict, empowering the regime and leading Syria into a political stalemate. Meanwhile, it has depoliticized the conflict root causes, fueling calls to normalize with this narcotic regime under the guise of pragmatism and humanitarian necessity. Resolution 2254, born in this very chamber in 2015, has been systematically undermined by your passive approach to the conflict's political core. Let's not forget, Syria's conflict did not emerge from a vacuum. It began with a regime massacring its own people, the same regime you're thanking today for opening borders and crossing points. Today, the political process is stalled, reduced to a futile constitutional path, and worse, it's diluted by multiple trajectories regionally and internationally to normalize with the regime. But it's in this context that Madaniya came into being, a collective of over 200 organizations with members and representatives present with me here today, working across all regions inside Syria and across all sectors, inside Syria and the diaspora, and coming together to reclaim political agency to our civic space. Not to replace any of the Syrian bodies engaged in the political process, but to assert our rightful role as civic actors in shaping the political future of our country. And to propose that we use all leverage to incentivize a genuine political solution. Members of the Council, two files, early recovery and refugee return, are critical here. While sustainable aid through early recovery is overdue, entrusting the Syrian regime with it undermines efforts for political progress. You are tampering with power dynamics on the ground. You are supposed to be exerting pressures on the regime to cooperate in the political process, not granting it critical files to fortify its grip of power over the lives of Syrians. early recovery should build the foundations of a principled state, not restore a criminal regime. Support must invest in building and bridging local institutional infrastructure, including that of Syrian civil society, across all regions, based on a human rights conditionality to rebuild Syria as a whole on a foundation of sovereignty and national ownership claimed by its own people, not by regimes who hold power through the rule of repression and violence. Similarly, refugee return must be voluntary, safe, and dignified. Yet, some member states misrepresent forced displacement as voluntary returns, portraying Syria as safe and using displacement as a tool for normalization. Those fleeing Israeli attacks in Lebanon or deported from neighboring countries are not returning home. They are being forcibly displaced. This demands a nuanced response, ensuring support and protection to those in need while addressing the root causes to create conditions for a voluntary return. And how so? By incentivizing the political process. Members of the Council, I will leave you with 3 messages. First, stop tampering with power dynamics through your passive political approaches. Your inaction is undermining Resolution 2254, empowering war criminals and worsening the situation, not just for us, but for the region, the international order, and ultimately for you. Second, leverage technical files to incentivize political progress. Demand irreversible concessions that can push the political process forward. Aid and accountability have been politicized to empower the Syrian regime for long. It's time that you ask how they can be used to shift power dynamics in favor of the Syrian people. And finally, work with us. We are the stakeholders in the future of Syria. We are the future of Syria. Any political settlement that's concluded at our expense, that denies our rights and dignity, will inevitably fail, because we will not rest until we claim back our state of citizenship and democracy.
I thank Ms. Abou Zainedin for her briefing.